Today, we are wading into a topic that usually just lives in the world of political rhetoric.
Mm.
We're looking at the real-world consequences, economic and human, of intensified immigration enforcement and the idea of mass deportations.
And our mission today is really to move past that rhetoric. We're going to use hard data, drawing a lot from this really deep economic analysis of California, but also weaving in some policy perspectives from across the U.S.
Right, to actually quantify the stakes.
Exactly, to see what happens when that kind of policy instability hits a massive economic reliance head-on.
And just to give you a sense of the scale we're talking about right away, here's the big fact up front.
It's a huge one.
According to this analysis, once you add in all the ripple effects, undocumented labor is responsible for generating up to nearly 9% of California's total GDP.
9%. I mean, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. This workforce is just this enormous economic engine, at the very foundation of one of the world's biggest economies.
So the cost of removal isn't just about lost wages.
Oh, not at all. It's the potential collapse of, well, foundational infrastructure and supply chains.
Okay, so let's unpack that engine. Let's start with the baseline numbers in California, since that's where the data is centered.
Right. And California is, uniquely reliant on immigrants. They make up over 27% of the state's population.
Which is the highest share in the entire country.
The highest, yeah. And within that group, we're focusing on about 2.28 million undocumented individuals. That population, it represents 8% of all workers in California.
And the key thing the sources stress is that this isn't a temporary workforce.
No, not at all. They're deeply rooted. Nearly two-thirds of them have lived in California for over a decade, and almost half for more than 20 years.
Which brings us to a number that I honestly found stunning in the sources.
I think I know which one you mean.
It has to be this one. Approximately 700,000 undocumented individuals, that's a third of them, they own their homes. I mean, what does home ownership even signify in a context of such legal uncertainty?
It signifies a massive, almost irreversible economic commitment. I mean, think about it. Buying a home takes long-term planning, it takes a steady income, a ton of risk.
Of course.
For this group to hit that kind of milestone, it just shows how deeply embedded they are in the community, in the local tax base. They're far more than just temporary workers.
And their economic contribution is, well, it's disproportionate. The sources point out their labor force participation rate is over 72%.
And that 72% is so important because it's 5% higher than the rate for native-born residents.
Wow.
So this workforce isn't just stable, it's incredibly active. And you have to remember that participation is basically stabilizing California's whole population.
Oh, so?
Well, without new international arrivals last year, the state would have actually lost 85,000 people.
Because of people moving out and lower birth rates.
Exactly. But instead, because of international migration, it saw a net gain of 49,000 people. Immigrant labor isn't just filling gaps, it's literally stopping the state from shrinking.
That's a powerful way to put it.
And we should probably note, the way people become unauthorized is changing too.
Right, the demographics are shifting.
Yeah. While about 47% of the state's current undocumented population is from Mexico, the new arrivals are much more diverse. They're coming from Central and South America and increasingly from Asia, especially China and India.
Which lines up with the national trend, right? The path is changing.
It is. Nationally, the estimate is that 42% of the undocumented population are visa overstays.
So they entered legally and just stayed.
Right. They didn't cross the border without authorization. And that demographic shift, it kind of changes the whole conversation around enforcement.
Okay, let's talk about the economic shockwave. If this deeply integrated workforce were, suddenly gone, what's the immediate price tag?
The calculated price is just catastrophic. The study breaks it down into a few pieces. So the direct impact, that's the value created by the workers themselves. That's a loss of $153 billion.
And that's just the start of it, I assume. You have to account for the ripple effects.
Precisely. You have to add the indirect effects, so disrupted supply chains, businesses that depend on that labor, and then the induced effects.
Which is the consumer spending.
Right. The massive drop in spending on things like groceries and rent when $153 billion in wages just vanishes. So when you put it all together, the total loss jumps to a stunning $278 billion in lost GDP.
$278 billion. Can you, I don't know, put that in some kind of global perspective for us?
Yeah, that loss would cause California's ranking among world economies, which is usually around 5th place, to fall 2 entire spots.
Just from removing this one group.
That's the measurable impact, yes.
Okay, let's dig into the industries that are most vulnerable. Starting with agriculture, which, I mean, this seems like a massive risk to the U.S. food supply.
It is. Over a quarter, 26% of the agricultural workforce is undocumented.
And California's role here is just indispensable. It's the only domestic producer for 19 different specialty crops.
Right, think about all the almonds, pistachios, olives. Basically, everything that's produced in the U.S. comes from there.
Yeah.
You take away the undocumented workforce, the agricultural GDP contracts by 14%.
And the sources had this really chilling little story about how fragile the system is.
The Kern County raids.
Yeah, one set of raids in Kern County in January of 2025 led immediately to a 25% no-show rate for work.
And that translated to losses in the small millions. But what does a 25% no-show rate really mean for a harvest?
It means the crops rot.
It means immediate crop spoilage and long-term price inflation for you, for everyone. I mean, these crops need careful manual harvesting at very specific times. If a quarter of your workforce disappears overnight, the crop stays on the ground. It's lost.
And you can't just switch to machines for that kind of work.
Not overnight. Not for those specialized crops.
Yep.
Impossible.
So the second huge vulnerability is construction, which, of course, threatens California's ability to deal with its housing crisis.
And the numbers are very similar. 26% of construction laborers are undocumented. The impact is a GDP shrinkage of nearly 16% for that sector.
And this is happening at a time when the industry is already at a breaking point.
Completely. I think the figure was 78% of firms already report they can't find qualified workers. So given that California is building less than a third of the housing it needs every year, this would just cripple any effort to fix the housing shortage. And it would raise costs for absolutely everyone.
So they're vital as workers. Let's look beyond that, though. How do they contribute outside of just, their wages? They're also entrepreneurs, taxpayers.
Oh, absolutely. They are serious business generators. Nearly 40% of all small businesses in California are owned by immigrants, and 11% are owned specifically by undocumented entrepreneurs.
And the concentration in some areas is just wild.
It's astonishing. Over 80% of small housekeeping businesses are immigrant-owned.
But what about that detail about the ownership concentration in construction? That was fascinating.
Yeah, that's a key point. In a critical field like construction labor, the share of undocumented business owners, at 32%, is actually higher than the share of undocumented employees, which is 26%.
So enforcement doesn't just remove a worker.
It can remove the whole business. The person who hires the team manages the projects. It collapses the entire operation.
And fiscally, they are huge contributors.
Massive. The total annual tax contribution from undocumented Californians is over $23 billion. That's local, state, and federal combined.
And there's a point here that really needs to be highlighted.
Mm-hmm. The tax rate.
Yes. The average state and local tax rate they pay is 7.1%.
Which, according to the research, is actually higher than the rate paid by the top 1% of earners in the entire country.
Wait, say that again. Their effective state and local tax rate is higher than the wealthiest Americans. That just completely flips the narrative of who is carrying the state financially.
It does. It underlines why California is already whistled a donor state. It pays $83 billion more in federal taxes than it gets back.
And that $23 billion from this population feeds right into that federal surplus.
Directly. Which brings us to another risk, the risk of what the report calls an ITIN collapse.
Right, the individual taxpayer identification number, the ID they use to file taxes without a social security number.
Exactly. So if that taxpayer information from the IRS gets shared with DHS, with immigration enforcement, well, trust is immediately gone. People will just stop filing taxes.
And the consequences of that loss of trust.
Huge fiscal consequences. Just in sales and excise taxes, they contribute $4.9 billion a year. One local official in the report warned that if that kind of consumption just stops, downtowns could become, and I'm quoting, a ghost town.
And we see that fear create collateral damage in public services, too. In schools, for example.
Yeah, fear of enforcement leads to more kids being absent from school. School funding is tied to attendance, so that means local funding cuts.
And in healthcare.
Right. Avoiding the doctor leads to worse health outcomes, which leads to more expensive last resort emergency room visits. This instability creates really expensive long-term public health problems.
Which brings us to the broader policy instability and the humanitarian side of this.
Yeah.
When politicians throw around the term mass deportation, what does that actually look like on the ground?
The sources show it's often a cumulative thing. It's a lot of smaller, targeted actions.
Not one single event.
No. It's raids, it's I-9 audits, it's high-profile sweeps. That Kern County raid we talked about, respondents said that felt like a test run.
And a federal judge later confirmed those raids illegally targeted Latinos.
Yes, which just created this pervasive climate of fear. And that fear is not just limited to the Latino community.
Right, the report mentioned other groups retreating.
Exactly. It notes that non-Latino groups, undocumented people from China and Korea, for example,
Mhm.
are also pulling back, into the shadows to avoid any attention. That further disrupts everything.
And this instability, it goes beyond just unauthorized immigrants. It affects legally protected groups too, like people with temporary protected status, or TPS.
hmm The administration announced it's ending TPS for Burma, effective January 2026. And the reason they gave was improvements in Burma's governance and stability.
And for anyone who doesn't know, TPS is a temporary protection from deportation for people from countries that are considered unsafe.
Right. Due to war or natural disaster, things like that. And terminating it for Burma based on improvements is just... It's in stark contrast to what the U.S. mission to the UN is reporting.
Which is what?
They're detailing an ongoing civil war, 3.6 million people displaced, and they're warning that any planned elections there would be fraudulent.
So ending TPS means sending people who have built lives and careers here back into a war zone.
Precisely. It's a direct clash between a policy decision and the verified humanitarian reality on the ground. And it's compounded by other things, like the Lake and Riley Act, which forces detention for undocumented immigrants accused of theft.
It removes judicial discretion.
Exactly. Or the plan we saw to re-interview hundreds of thousands of refugees who were already admitted, already vetted.
Which advocates called a vindictive, harmful, and wasteful attack.
Because they've already been through rigorous checks. Re-interviewing them just re-traumatizes families and wastes taxpayer money to scrutinize people who are already cleared.
All this instability really brings us to the need for humanitarian oversight in detention. The group Physicians for Human Rights, PHR, they're pushing for much better data collection.
Transparency is the only path to accountability. PHR wants data on how long people are detained, the reason why, any vulnerabilities they have, and what alternatives were considered before they use something like solitary confinement.
And why is that level of detail so critical?
Because without it, these facilities just operate in darkness. We've seen why this matters. ICIA had to terminate contracts in Bristol County, Massachusetts back in 2021 after finding systematic civil rights violations.
And PHR has a long history with this kind of work.
A very long history. They shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997 for their work on landmines. So when they advocate for this, it's rooted in decades of documenting these kinds of severe human rights issues.
So with all this economic integration on one hand and policy instability on the other, what is the response from other sectors, like business leaders?
Well, they emphasize that any workable solution has to make sense from both a social justice and an economic standpoint.
But the main challenge for them is fear.
Fear is the #1 challenge.
Yeah.
They are really hesitant to speak up publicly. They're afraid of political backlash, but mostly they're afraid of endangering their own workers. One business owner put it very plainly. He just said, I'm not going to put them in that position.
So how are they trying to make their voices heard then?
The strategy is to build these broad multi-sector coalitions, getting the restaurant industry, the hotel industry, the powerful agricultural lobby, all to speak to Congress with one unified voice.
To stress economic risks and demand legalization options.
It's seen as really the only viable path forward.
And in the meantime, on the ground, the immigrant-serving organizations are just swamped.
They're at a breaking point. Attendance at their Know Your Rights workshops, it doubles or triples whenever fear spikes. Their legal services are critically strained, especially in rural areas.
To the point where they're asking for state intervention.
Yeah, asking to allow out-of-state attorneys to practice just to handle the sheer volume of cases.
And this forces them to make sacrifices in other areas.
It does. These organizations have to pause other vital programs like financial aid help, college prep, things like that, just to handle the urgent, immediate legal needs tied to enforcement. The system is just not built to handle this level of instability.
So to summarize this deep dive, on one side, you have this incredibly stable, deeply rooted, frankly indispensable workforce. They're generating nearly 9% of California's GDP, paying billions in taxes, and literally keeping the state's population from shrinking.
And on the other side, you have this political enforcement instability that threatens a catastrophic economic loss of $278 billion.
And that cost, it wouldn't just stay in California.
No, not at all. Given that the state is already a huge donor state, paying $83 billion more in federal taxes than it gets back, If California's economy stumbles because of this, the financial burden and the global ripple effects would absolutely affect the entire U.S. economy.
That is the essential knowledge from this deep dive. And here's one final provocative thought for you to mull over. Research shows that for every 1 million unauthorized immigrants who are deported, native-born workers actually lose jobs.
Because of reduced business investment and consumer demand.
Exactly. So if these mass deportation policies lead to widespread inflation in food and housing, which the sources warn about, what specific things might you notice first? Think about how quickly your average grocery bill, or maybe your next rent check, might inflate as a direct result of these supply chain shocks.
Something to consider deeply as these high-stakes policy debates move forward.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.